saying your name and your affiliation, if you would, so we have that, the tape identified.
Okay, my name is Michael Pemberton. I'm a professor of writing and linguistics at Georgia Southern University.
And could you talk a little bit about whose research has impacted yours the most and why that's the case?
Well, probably the research that has impacted mine the most is research that's directly related to one of my several areas of emphasis in rhetoric and composition, and that's writing center studies. I've directed a writing center pretty much for my whole professional career for about 20 years. And a number of the people whose research impacted the way I looked at that were people like Mikey Harris, who published the Writing Lab newsletter, Neil Lerner, who has done a tremendous amount of very significant historical and empirical research about writing center work, probably people like Christina Murphy, who wrote a momentous article a number of years ago about social constructionism in the writing center, which I thought was not only brilliantly researched and written, but also something that had a tremendous impact on my own perception of what it was I was trying to do in my work as a writing center professional and as a writing center scholar. Earlier in my career, when I was a graduate student, I was probably influenced most by the work of Linda Flower and John Hayes. I grew up at a time, or I got my degree at a time, when cognitive research was at the forefront of a lot of rhetoric and communication studies, and the director of my dissertation was Professor Charles Cooper, who was also very heavily invested in cognitive work. So that also seemed to resonate quite strongly with some of my backgrounds in doing work in computer technology and the sciences, and it seemed to fit my perception about how people learned to write and how they produced writing and what were the sources of some of the problems that they had in writing. So even though that's a little bit outmoded and it's been supplanted somewhat by more recent scholarship in the field, that was probably the work that had the biggest impact on me as I was developing my professional sensibilities.
And that leads us nicely into what you see as the current trends in research, and what trends do you see as important, what trends do you see as lasting?
Well, even though cognitive approaches towards rhetoric and composition lasted for a relatively short period of time, they were taken over by a period of social constructionism and the notion that knowledge was constructed through social and cultural contexts. It was affected by postmodernist theories and feminist theories. And now the field, even for the last 10 to 15 years, it's had a pretty long run, seems to be focused primarily on things like identity formation, the ways in which individuals and groups of people construct their identities through writing, through text, through communicative practices, through discourses, how multiple discourses impact and influence one another. And if you take a look at the conference programs at the Four Cs for the last 10 years or so, you'll see that there are a huge number of presentations and, in fact, later articles that were written for professional publication that focus on this question of what it means to develop one's identity as an individual, as a member of a group, and how a variety of cultural and social identities can come into conflict with one another. How they interact with discourses of power in one way or another, and what this means for the teaching of composition. I'm not sure that this is necessarily going to be a lasting trend, although it is one that is very long-lasting in terms of the profession itself. And part of the reason why I say that is because I have a few concerns about the extent to which the composition community and people who do research in these areas have been able to communicate the work that they do to a much larger audience other than themselves. I think that within the composition and discourse community, there's a sense of shared values that people see this as worthwhile, as meaningful, as significant. But I suspect that in terms of communicating this to a larger community, be it local communities, state communities, legislatures, politicians, people who are in charge of the budget strings, which is an especially important thing for us to be concerned about right now, I'm not sure that it's ever phrased or discussed in ways that make it important or valuable enough to ensure continued funding. My big worry is that people will see this as an extension of the kind of liberal, touchy-feely, feel good about yourselves, play up minority groups, appeal to very specific constituencies that has actually a lot of value and a lot of interest to people in the academic community for reasons that go far beyond just identity politics. But I don't think that message is necessarily getting conveyed well enough to people who are ultimately going to be responsible for the purse strings and continued funding in this area. So that's my concern.
Do you see other potential paths of research that might be more appealing to the groups that you're talking about?
I actually think that there are some ways that this research could extend into further growth. One of which would be, there's an ongoing discussion about literacies of civic engagement and community outreach that I think have very clear practical applications that can appeal to a wide range of audiences and interests. And I also think that it ties in very nicely to the kinds of research and scholarship and identity politics and theoretical discussions that are going on right now in rhetoric and composition. I would like to see the field begin to move even more in those directions, and to do so in a way that extends the conversation beyond just the limits of academia, but also into, as I was saying before, much larger communities, audiences, and groups that can then begin to see not only the significance of this in terms of research, but also the very tangible, the results that inform members of the community, that lead to a more educated electorate and body politic, and that will appeal to a whole diverse assortment of communities as well.
What's the best advice you ever got about doing research in composition?
The best advice I ever got about doing research in composition can be illustrated by a story from my graduate career. When I was trying to decide what to do for a dissertation and get my degree and go on the job market and become a world-renowned professor, which is still yet to happen, I posed a question to my dissertation advisor, who was Dr. Charles Cooper. And I said, well, Charles, there are two ways that I can go with my research. I can do a quick and dirty case study and investigate it in my classroom, give it a theoretical framework, write it up, crank out that dissertation, and get my degree in a relatively short period of time with relatively few headaches. There were other people in my program who had done things like that, and I was considering that as a possible option. And I said, the other half of me says, well, I could do a more theoretically focused research study that takes a look at it. What I was studying at the time was modeling theory and the applications that it had to cognitive models of composition. And I could do an entirely theoretical study. It would be much more difficult and probably not as long. It would take me longer to write, and it would definitely be challenging. But it's really kind of interesting to me, and I've been reading about this, and I'm excited about it. And he looked at me and he said, you've just told me two things that have already answered your question. He said, first of all, you say it's going to be more difficult and challenging, and that's a good thing. But he said the second thing, which is actually more important, is you're excited about it. It's something that I can tell you want to do. So that's what I would recommend that you do. Always go with your passions. Go with what you love. Don't listen to anybody else. Don't go for the quick and dirty way out. Don't look for the easy publication. Do something that you are interested in, that you love, that you want to pursue, because even if it doesn't turn out very well, you'll be very happy that you did it and you will have learned something. So if I were going to be giving advice to anybody else, I would just replicate the same advice that was given to me, which is always go with your passions, always go with what you're interested in. Don't listen to the naysayers or the negative voices. Just pursue your own interests, and ultimately you'll end up being successful as a result.
Perfect.
And I think that also ties into the worst advice that I was ever given. And the story I have to tell about that is that early in my postgraduate career, I was just hired as an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, looking for my first publications. And I decided ultimately that my dissertation, although I enjoyed writing it and it was good, it really wasn't a book-length manuscript. It wasn't something that could be fleshed out into something that could be farmed to an academic press. So I wanted to change it into an article. And I did that. I took the gist of it, I took the important points, I distilled it down into what I thought was a really good article, and I sent it off to the premier journal in the field, the 3 Cs, College Composition and Communication. And the editor sent it out to 2 reviewers, one of whom I found out later was Linda Flower, which was a little bit surprising and a little bit frightening at the same time. And there was also an unidentified second reviewer. Since my dissertation was on cognitive approaches to the study of writing and the ways in which researchers constructed models of this approach, Linda Flower gave a very detailed, critical, but very detailed overview, made suggestions, gave me a lot of very good advice for how to revise it. The second reviewer wrote a 1-paragraph response that said, in essence, this is just more of that stupid cognitive stuff. Why are you even considering publishing this in the journal? And there wasn't an awful lot more to it than that. The clear implication being, nobody's paying any attention to this, nobody thinks it's interesting, and I'm not even going to give it the benefit of giving it a detailed critique. I'm just going to dismiss it. So I would say that was probably the worst advice I ever got. And it is also advice that has had a tremendous number of positive effects in my later life and career. First of all, it allowed me to be able to tell stories like this one and to tell people, when you send your work out for review, there are people who aren't going to like it, there are people who aren't going to like you, don't listen to them. And the other thing that it's done is that since I have since myself gone on to become the editor of a journal, I now take a much more professional interest in the way that my reviewers respond to other people's writing. And if somebody had written a response like that for me as an editor to send to a potential author, I would not send it out. I would say the second reviewer didn't like your article quite as much, and I don't think it's worthwhile to send the comments. But here's the gist, and you can deal with it as you would. And I will say that the editor of the 3 Cs at the time, whose name for some reason I'm drawing a blank on, sent me the short review and attached a comment of his own just saying, I'm going to pass this on to you, just make of it what you will. And the happy version of the story is I ended up revising the article, and it did get published in the 3 Cs subsequently. So to that anonymous second reviewer, I just want to say, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. This is great. Thank you.
Good.
I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. It was